The rain fell against the windows of the Pemberton townhouse in a steady, melancholic rhythm that echoed the quiet desolation of Rosalind Ashworth's heart. It was autumn in London, 1818, and the world beyond the glass panes shimmered with that peculiar grey light that seemed to drain colour from everything it touched, leaving only shadows and the memory of brighter days. She stood at the window of the drawing-room, her slender frame draped in a gown of sombre dove grey, not quite mourning, but never anything approaching gaiety, and watched the carriages pass on the street below, their wheels splashing through puddles that reflected the leaden sky. At 23, Rosalind possessed a beauty that seemed somehow muted, as though life had taken an eraser to her more vibrant qualities and left only the softest, most subdued outlines. Pale skin that rarely saw sunshine, dark hair arranged in the simplest of styles, eyes of hazel that might once have sparkled with mirth but now held only a careful, watchful stillness. She was companion to Lady Pemberton, an elderly widow of impeccable respectability and diminishing social energy, a position that suited Rosalind perfectly, for it allowed her to exist on the very periphery of society, present but not participating, visible but not truly seen. "Rosalind, dear, you shall catch a chill standing by that draughty window." Lady Pemberton's voice drifted from her chair by the fire, gentle and concerned in the way of one who had grown genuinely fond of her quiet companion. Rosalind turned with a small, practiced smile, the kind that conveyed pleasantness without revealing anything of substance. "Forgive me, my lady. I was merely watching the rain." But she had not been watching the rain at all. Not truly. She had been watching the couple across the street, sheltering together beneath a shared umbrella, laughing as they hurried toward their waiting carriage. And she had felt that familiar ache bloom in her chest like a bruise pressed upon. There had been a time when she had imagined such simple intimacies for herself, when she had believed in love and courtship and the promise of a future bright with possibility. That girl seemed a stranger to her now, separated not merely by 5 years, but by a chasm of shame and loss so profound that Rosalind could scarcely recall what hope had felt like. She moved away from the window and took up her needlework, settling into her customary chair with the ease of long practice, her needle moving through fabric with small, precise stitches that required no thought, only the mechanical repetition that had become her life, predictable, safe, and utterly, irrevocably alone. 5 years earlier, Rosalind had been an altogether different creature, a girl of 18 springs with eyes that sparkled like light through amber and a heart so full of dreams it seemed they might spill out of her at any moment, cascading into the world in a shower of hope and longing and that peculiar innocence that comes from having never yet been wounded by life's crueler lessons. It had been her first season, and she had entered London society with all the breathless anticipation of one who believed the world a place of romance and possibility, where handsome gentlemen swept maidens off their feet, and love conquered all obstacles with the ease found in the novels she had devoured in her father's library. Her mother had presented her at court, her gown of pristine white, a testament to her purity and the bright future that seemed to stretch before her like an endless summer day. She had danced at Almack's, attended garden parties at grand estates, and felt the exhilarating rush of being young and admired, and full of the conviction that something marvelous awaited her just around the corner. And then she had met him, Lord Edmund Ashcroft, with his golden hair that caught the candlelight, and his poet's tongue that wove words into spells of such beauty that she had been utterly, foolishly, catastrophically enchanted. He had been perhaps 27, possessed of that dangerous combination of charm and Weltschmerz that made impressionable young ladies believe they alone could heal whatever hidden wound had made him so attractively melancholic. He had quoted Byron to her at a musicale, his voice low and intimate, as though the words were meant only for her ears, and she had felt herself falling even then, tumbling into an infatuation so complete it obliterated every cautionary tale her mother had ever whispered about Rake's Progress and Broken Hearts. There had been midnight meetings in the Ashworth garden, arranged through notes passed by her maid who had thought it all terribly romantic, and in those moonlit encounters Edmund had spoken of love, eternal, and souls destined to intertwine, had kissed her with a passion that made her forget every warning about propriety and consequence. He had given her a volume of sonnets inscribed with promises of devotion, had touched her face with fingers that trembled, or had she only imagined that trembling, projecting onto him her own earnest emotion, and had, on a night when the stars seemed to conspire with her reckless heart, led her into the gardener's cottage and persuaded her, with words of love and forever and trust, to surrender the one thing society decreed she must preserve until marriage. She had given herself to him completely, believing with every fiber of her naive being that this was merely the prelude to a lifetime together, that his whispered words of devotion were as binding as any wedding vow, and that the physical union they shared was the natural expression of a love too powerful to be constrained by convention. The morning after that fateful surrender in the gardener's cottage, Rosalind had awakened with her heart full of dreams and her mind already spinning with imaginings of the proposal that must surely come, the wedding that would sanctify what had passed between them, the future that stretched before them bright with promise. But Edmund had not called that day, nor the next, and when finally she contrived to encounter him at a soirée 3 evenings later, he had looked through her as though she were made of glass, as though she were nothing more than empty air, and when she had gathered her courage and approached him with trembling hands and hope still clinging desperately to life, he had drawn her aside with an expression of such cold indifference that it seemed impossible. This was the same man who had whispered words of eternal devotion against her skin. "You must understand, Miss Ashworth, that what passed between us was merely a dalliance, a pleasant interlude, and you would do well to forget it as I intend to do," he had said, his voice clinical and detached, and she had felt the world tilt beneath her feet, felt something fundamental shatter inside her chest like porcelain dropped upon stone. She had tried to speak, to remind him of his promises, to appeal to whatever honor or conscience might reside within him, but he had simply turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the shadowed alcove, with tears streaming down her face, and the terrible knowledge that she had been utterly, completely deceived. Her brother Thomas, 2 years her senior and fierce in his protective devotion, had discovered her weeping in her chamber that night, and extracted the whole sordid truth from her with gentle persistence, and his rage had been magnificent and terrible to behold. He had immediately sought out Edmund and challenged him to a duel, demanding satisfaction for his sister's ruined honor, and Edmund, that coward dressed in a gentleman's clothing, had accepted with aristocratic bravado, but no genuine courage. The duel had taken place at dawn in a misty field outside London, and Thomas, who had never been particularly skilled with pistols but was driven by righteous fury, had fallen with Edmund's bullet in his chest, his lifeblood seeping into the indifferent earth, while Rosalind's world collapsed entirely around her. Edmund had fled to the continent before he could be brought to justice, disappearing into the anonymity of foreign cities, while Rosalind was left to face the consequences of their liaison alone. Society, which had once welcomed her with open arms, now closed ranks against her with vicious efficiency. The whispers began immediately, spreading like poison through ballrooms and drawing rooms, and within a fortnight everyone knew that Miss Rosalind Ashworth had given herself to a rake who had abandoned her, that her brother had died defending her tarnished honor, that she was ruined beyond any hope of redemption. Her parents, devastated by Thomas's death and ashamed of their daughter's disgrace, had retreated to their country estate and made it clear that while they would not cast her out entirely, neither could they welcome her presence in their grief-stricken household, and so Rosalind had been sent to live with a distant cousin in Yorkshire, exiled from the only world she had ever known, transformed in the span of mere weeks from a hopeful girl anticipating a brilliant future into a cautionary tale, whispered about by mothers, warning their daughters about the wages of sin and the perfidy of handsome men with poets, tongues and hearts of stone. The present had become a careful existence, lived in the margins of the world that had once promised her everything, a half-life of quiet duties and deliberate invisibility that Rosalind had cultivated, with the same meticulous attention a gardener might give to pruning roses, cutting away anything that might attract notice, might invite either pity or contempt, might remind her too acutely of all she had lost. Her days with Lady Pemberton followed a comforting rhythm of sameness, mornings spent reading aloud from whatever novel or memoir the elderly woman fancied, her voice steady and pleasant as she brought to life stories of other people's adventures and romances, while her own heart remained carefully locked away. Afternoons devoted to correspondence and household management, for Lady Pemberton's arthritis made writing difficult, and she relied upon Rosalind's neat hand to maintain her extensive network of connections. Evenings occasionally spent in the drawing room, when her employer entertained small and respectable gatherings of similarly aged friends who treated Rosalind with a kind of benign disregard that was infinitely preferable to the cutting cruelty she had endured in the first months after her fall from grace. She had learned to find contentment, or something resembling it, in small things: the pleasure of a particularly well-written passage in a book, the satisfaction of arranging flowers just so in the morning room, the comfort of her modest but private chamber, where she could let her guard down and allow herself to feel the loneliness that was her constant companion. I have survived. She would tell herself on difficult days when the weight of her isolation pressed particularly hard against her chest. And survival is itself a form of victory, however small. She had learned to accept that certain doors were closed to her forever: marriage, children, the easy companionship of female friends, the simple joy of moving through society without bearing the invisible brand of her disgrace. And she had made a sort of peace with her diminished existence, though sometimes in the darkest hours of night she would wake with tears on her face from dreams of a different life, dreams in which Thomas still lived, and she had never met a golden-haired rake with a poet's tongue and a heart of pure selfishness. Just last week she had encountered two women who had been her intimate friends during that ill-fated season, and they had quite literally turned their backs upon seeing her approach in the lending library, their skirts swishing with the sharp finality of doors slamming shut, and Rosalind had stood frozen for a long moment before turning and walking away with her head held high and her eyes burning with unshed tears, proud at least that she had not allowed them to see how deeply their cut had wounded. Her evening routine had become a kind of meditation in solitude. She would help Lady Pemberton prepare for bed, then retreat to her own small sitting room, where she would read by candlelight until her eyes grew heavy, sometimes allowing herself a single glass of sherry that spread warmth through her chest and softened the sharp edges of her loneliness. And always, before extinguishing her candle, she would look out her window at the London streets below and wonder if this careful, circumscribed existence was all that remained to her for the rest of her days, if she would grow old in the shadows while life and love and joy remained forever just beyond her reach, phantoms of a future that had died along with her brother in that misty field 5 years ago. The Duke of Ravensmore arrived at Lady Pemberton's modest evening gathering on a Tuesday in late October, with all the dramatic impact of a winter storm breaking over a calm sea, and Rosalind, who had been arranging teacups with her usual quiet efficiency, felt the change in the room's atmosphere before she even looked up to identify its source. The conversations grew hushed and then louder with brittle excitement. The air itself seemed to shimmer with sudden tension, and Lady Pemberton's roomy eyes grew wide with an astonishment that bordered on shock. Alexander Thornfield was a figure of legend even among the highest echelons of society, a man whose wealth was spoken of in tones usually reserved for discussing natural phenomena or acts of God, whose properties sprawled across 3 counties, and whose investments had allegedly doubled the already staggering fortune he had inherited at the age of 21. At 32 he remained stubbornly, almost defiantly unmarried despite the determined campaigns of every ambitious mama in London, and his reputation was that of a man more interested in intellectual pursuits than social ones. He was known to spend months at his country estate, absorbed in his extensive library, to correspond with philosophers and scientists across Europe, and to regard the marriage mart with barely concealed disdain, and the simpering debutantes paraded before him each season with an indifference that might have been insulting had it not been so utterly impartial. He was tall, Rosalind noticed, despite her determination to remain invisible and unobtrusive, with dark hair silvering slightly at the temples and features that were more striking than handsome, all sharp angles and austere planes that suggested both intelligence and a certain controlled severity, and he moved through Lady Pemberton's crowded drawing-room with the unconscious authority of a man long accustomed to being the most powerful person in any space he occupied. She tried to fade into the background, as was her habit, to become merely part of the furniture, useful and unremarkable, but some instinct made her glance up at precisely the wrong moment, or perhaps the right one, for time itself seemed to hesitate, and found herself meeting eyes of such startling grey. They reminded her of winter clouds pregnant with snow, eyes that held an unexpected depth of perception that made her feel suddenly alarmingly visible in a way she had not been in 5 long years. The moment stretched and held, lasting perhaps only seconds but feeling much longer, and in that suspended space Rosalind experienced the disconcerting sensation of being truly seen, not merely looked at, but observed, with an attention that seemed to perceive beyond the careful mask of calm competence she had constructed, beyond the drab dove-grey dress and severely styled hair, beyond the armor of invisibility she wore like a second skin, and the intensity of that regard made something flutter nervously in her chest. Not hope, surely not that treacherous thing, but perhaps its distant cousin, a tentative curiosity about what those penetrating eyes might have glimpsed in her own carefully guarded gaze before she dropped her lashes and turned away, her hands trembling slightly as she busied herself once more with the teacups, aware with every nerve in her body that something had shifted, that the Duke of Ravensmore had noticed her, and that nothing in her carefully ordered existence might ever be quite the same again. She had barely managed to compose herself, her pulse still beating an erratic rhythm against her throat, when she sensed, rather than saw his approach. The conversations around her seemed to part like water before the prow of a ship. And then he was there, standing before the table where she had taken refuge behind the silver tea service, and his voice when he spoke was deeper than she had expected, cultured and measured with an underlying timbre that suggested both authority and something else she could not quite identify, perhaps a carefully banked intensity that his formal demeanor sought to contain. "I wonder if you might recommend which of Lady Pemberton's selections I should choose," he said, gesturing toward the tea offerings with a slight inclination of his head that somehow managed to convey both courtesy and a hint of dry amusement. "For I confess I am woefully ignorant in such matters, and would benefit greatly from the guidance of someone who clearly possesses both taste and discernment." The compliment, if it could be called such, was so unexpected that Rosalind found herself meeting those remarkable grey eyes once more, searching for mockery or pity, and finding instead what appeared to be genuine interest, though she could not fathom why a man of his stature would concern himself with the opinion of a mere paid companion. "The Earl Grey is particularly fine, Your Grace," she managed, proud that her voice emerged steady despite the confusion churning within her. "And Lady Pemberton is quite proud of her blend of chamomile and lavender for the evening hours." He accepted the cup she prepared with hands that were elegant, despite their obvious strength. Her long fingers that she noticed bore ink stains, suggesting he was indeed the scholar his reputation claimed. And then, most bewildering of all, he made no move to retreat, but instead remained standing near her station, effectively drawing her into conversation while the rest of the room watched with barely concealed fascination. "I understand you are responsible for managing Lady Pemberton's library," he continued, and Rosalind wondered who could have told him such a thing, for it was hardly common knowledge that she catalogued and organized the elderly woman's extensive collection. "I noticed she has acquired a first edition of Wollstonecraft's Vindication, a provocative choice. Have you read it?" The question was a test, she realized, or perhaps an offering, and despite every instinct that screamed at her to remain invisible and unremarkable, she found herself responding with more honesty than was wise. "I have, Your Grace. I found her arguments compelling, though society would deem them dangerous." Something flickered in his eyes, approval perhaps, or recognition, and for the next quarter hour they spoke of philosophy and literature, while Rosalind forgot to be careful, forgot to guard her tongue and hide her intelligence, forgot everything except the unexpected pleasure of genuine intellectual discourse with someone who seemed to value her thoughts rather than merely tolerate them. When Lady Pemberton finally approached with poorly concealed delight and wonder dancing in her aged features, the Duke turned to her hostess with impeccable courtesy, but not before his gaze returned once more to Rosalind, holding for a beat longer than propriety strictly allowed. "Lady Pemberton, you have been keeping quite the treasure hidden," he said with that same subtle humor warming his austere features. "I wonder if I might prevail upon your hospitality to call again. I find myself most interested in continuing certain conversations left unfinished this evening." After he departed, leaving a wake of whispered speculation and scandalized excitement, Lady Pemberton gripped Rosalind's arm with surprising strength, her voice trembling with something between hope and trepidation. "Child," she whispered urgently, "the Duke of Ravensmore has never, in all his years in society, requested to call upon any household for the purpose of furthering acquaintance with an unmarried woman. Whatever just transpired, and it was no ordinary exchange. But Rosalind, her mind still reeling from the unexpected attention, and her heart caught between wariness and a dangerous flicker of something she dared not name, could only shake her head in bewilderment, unable to imagine what interest such a man could possibly have in a ruined woman who had long ago resigned herself to living forever in the shadows. Yet unable to deny that for the first time in 5 years she had felt almost like the girl she used to be, intelligent, valued, seen, and the sensation was as terrifying as it was achingly, impossibly sweet. The weeks that followed transformed Lady Pemberton's quiet household into something resembling a stage upon which a most unusual courtship unfolded. For the Duke of Ravensmoor called no fewer than 7 times in the span of those autumn days, arriving with books he thought might interest Rosalind and engaging her in conversations that ranged from the philosophical to the political, always treating her as an intellectual equal rather than a ruined woman to be pitied or a companion to be patronized, until the afternoon came when he requested a private audience in Lady Pemberton's small study, and Rosalind entered that book-lined room with her heart hammering against her ribs, knowing somehow that whatever was about to transpire would alter the careful equilibrium of her existence irrevocably. He stood by the window overlooking the modest garden, his tall frame silhouetted against the grey November light, and when he turned to face her, his expression was grave, almost somber, as though he were about to undertake some weighty business transaction which, she would soon learn, was precisely how he viewed what he was about to propose. "Miss Ashworth," he began without preamble, for he was not a man given to unnecessary decoration of speech, "I have a proposition to put before you that will likely strike you as extraordinary, perhaps even offensive, but I ask that you hear me out entirely before rendering judgment." She nodded mutely, her hands clasped before her to still their trembling, and he continued with the same measured deliberation he might employ when discussing a matter of estate management. "I find myself in need of a wife, not for romantic reasons, you understand, but for practical ones. I require an heir to secure my line, and I desire a companion of intelligence with whom I might share intellectual discourse without the tedious pretenses that plague most society marriages. I am aware of your history, Miss Ashworth, and I tell you plainly that it does not signify to me. What occurred 5 years ago was the result of a scoundrel's machinations and a young woman's understandable trust, not evidence of deficient character." The words struck her like physical blows, each one seeming both impossibly generous and somehow insulting in its clinical detachment, and she found herself gripping the back of a nearby chair for support. "Your Grace, I cannot fathom why you would consider such an arrangement when you could have your pick of unsullied debutantes from the finest families," she managed, her voice emerging thin and strained. "I am ruined, a woman without prospects or reputation, hardly fit to be a duchess." His grey eyes held hers with unwavering steadiness, and she saw in them a complexity that belied his austere demeanour, pain carefully controlled, determination born of some past wound, and something that might have been loneliness, though he would never name it such. "It is precisely because of your circumstances that you are ideal for what I propose," he said quietly. "I do not want a wife who will harbour romantic expectations I cannot fulfill. I do not want a marriage complicated by sentiment or the inevitable disappointments that follow when affection proves insufficient to sustain a union. What I offer is honest partnership, built on mutual respect and clearly defined terms. You would have my name, my protection, my fortune at your disposal, and complete restoration in society's eyes. In return, I ask only for heirs and companionship, nothing more." The proposal was so shocking in its cold practicality, so utterly devoid of anything resembling courtship or affection, that Rosalind found herself shaking her head in instinctive refusal, even as part of her mind recognized the extraordinary opportunity being presented. "I cannot, Your Grace," she whispered, though whether she was protecting him from a ruined woman's taint or protecting herself from inevitable hurt, she could not have said. "I cannot accept such generosity when I bring nothing but shame to the arrangement." He moved then, not toward her but to the chair opposite, settling into it with a heaviness that suggested the weight of more than just physical form, and when he spoke again his voice had lost some of its clinical detachment, revealing beneath the carefully constructed reserve a vulnerability that shocked her more thoroughly than his proposal had done. "Perhaps," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on his hands rather than her face, I should tell you why I seek such an arrangement, for you deserve to understand that this proposition does not stem from charitable impulse or noble condescension, but from my own wounds and the lessons they have taught me about the dangers of sentiment." He paused, seeming to gather himself, and Rosalind found herself sinking into the chair he had indicated, compelled by the shift in his demeanor from ducal authority to something far more human. "When I was 24, I believed myself in love with a woman, the daughter of an earl, beautiful and accomplished, everything society deemed appropriate for a future duchess. I courted her with all the romantic fervor of youth, wrote her poetry, imagined our future, opened my heart with a completeness I now recognize as foolish. On the eve of our engagement announcement, I discovered her in the conservatory with my closest friend, and the cruelty of their laughter as they discussed how easily I had been manipulated for the sake of my title and fortune." His voice broke almost imperceptibly, and Rosalind felt her heart constrict with unexpected sympathy. "That night taught me that romantic love is at best an illusion, and at worst a weapon by which the unscrupulous exploit the foolish. I determined then that I would never again allow sentiment to cloud my judgment or make me vulnerable to betrayal. But time passes, duty demands heirs, and I find myself in need of a practical solution." He looked up then, his grey eyes meeting hers with such stark honesty that she felt the impact of it, like a physical touch. "You speak of bringing shame to this arrangement, Miss Ashworth, but I tell you plainly that I view your circumstances as an advantage rather than a detriment. You have no illusions about love or romance. Life has stripped them from you as thoroughly as betrayal stripped them from me. You would enter this marriage with clear eyes and realistic expectations, seeking security and restoration rather than affection that inevitably curdles into disappointment or manipulation. I can offer you protection that extends beyond mere financial security. My name carries enough weight to silence even the cruelest gossips. My connections are sufficient to restore your position in society completely, and my wealth would ensure you want for nothing material. You would have your own apartments, your own pursuits, complete freedom in all matters save those that directly concern the succession. I would never importune you beyond what is necessary for the production of heirs, and even in that I would proceed only with your consent and consideration for your comfort." The portrait he painted was both generous and heartbreaking in its cold practicality, a marriage built not on hope but on the ruins of hope, and yet Rosalind found herself understanding the appeal of such an arrangement. No expectations meant no disappointments, no vulnerability meant no betrayal, no love meant no devastation when it inevitably proved false. "I ask only for your companionship, your intelligence in conversation, your discretion regarding the true nature of our arrangement, and in time, children who will secure the succession and perhaps bring some measure of joy to both our careful existences," he continued, and now his voice held something that might have been plea, though his pride would never allow him to beg. "In return, you would be a duchess, respected and protected, free from the shadows where you currently dwell, able to hold your head high in any assembly. It is, I acknowledge, a cold bargain compared to the romantic dreams young women are taught to cherish, but it is honest, and I suspect you value honesty above pretty lies." Rosalind sat in silence for a long moment, her mind reeling with the implications of what he offered and what he revealed, and finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I must have time to consider, Your Grace. This is not a decision to be made lightly, for all that it is framed as a practical arrangement." He inclined his head, rising with fluid grace, and as he moved toward the door he paused, turning back to fix her with that penetrating grey gaze once more. "Take whatever time you require, Miss Ashworth. I am a patient man, and this is too important a decision to be rushed. But know this, I would not have made this offer if I did not believe we could build something worthwhile together, even if that something bears little resemblance to what others call marriage." That evening found Rosalind in her small chamber at the top of Lady Pemberton's townhouse, seated by the window where rain now fell in earnest against the glass, each droplet a mirror to the tumultuous thoughts cascading through her mind as she contemplated the extraordinary proposal that had upended the careful resignation with which she had clothed herself these past 5 years. Asterisk, to be a duchess, asterisk, she thought, testing the words like one might test the stability of a bridge long abandoned, asterisk, to walk into assemblies without whispers following, to hold my head high instead of keeping to the shadows, to have security and protection, and a name that commands respect rather than pity or disdain. Asterisk. The practical advantages were undeniable, overwhelming even, and yet beneath the temptation of restoration lay something more troubling, the memory of who she had once been. That bright-eyed girl of 18 who had believed in love with the fervent certainty of youth, who had surrendered everything for what she thought was passion, who had learned in the cruelest possible way that such surrender led only to devastation. Could she enter another arrangement, even one built on honesty rather than deception, without risking whatever fragile equilibrium she had achieved? The Duke had been clear about his expectations, or rather, his lack of them, and there was something almost appealing in the cold practicality of his proposal, a marriage without the dangerous illusions that had destroyed her before. And yet she could not quite silence the small voice that mourned for dreams she had thought long buried, for the possibility of genuine connection she had convinced herself she no longer desired. A soft knock interrupted her circular contemplation, and Lady Pemberton entered with the careful deliberation of age, settling into the chair opposite with a knowing look that suggested she understood far more than had been explicitly shared. "My dear," the elderly woman said gently, her rheumy eyes nevertheless sharp with perception, "I have known you these 3 years, and I have watched you exist rather than live, moving through your days with competence but without joy. And I tell you now that if the Duke's proposal offers you even the possibility of more than this half-life, you would be foolish to refuse it out of fear." Rosalind felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected wisdom, and she turned back to the rain-streaked window. "But what if I am incapable of more, my lady? What if the girl who could feel deeply was destroyed 5 years ago, and all that remains is this hollow creature who has learned to survive, but not to truly live? Would it not be a cruelty to bind him to such a wife?" Lady Pemberton reached across to pat her hand with surprising strength. "The Duke is not seeking a romantic heroine, child. He has been quite clear about that. But perhaps in seeking practical partnership, you might both discover that survival can slowly transform into something richer, given time and patience. You need not decide from love or even hope, decide from wisdom and from recognition of opportunity, from acknowledgement that your current existence, safe as it may be, is not truly a life at all." The words struck deep, finding truth Rosalind had avoided examining, and as the evening deepened into night, she sat long in contemplation, weighing fear against possibility, until finally, as the clock struck midnight, she realized her decision had already been made, not from hope, for she had learned the danger of hope, but from the simple recognition that remaining in shadows was itself a kind of death, and the Duke's cold bargain offered at least the chance of stepping back into the light, however carefully, however guardedly, however much she protected the battered remnants of her heart. The announcement appeared in the Times 3 days after Rosalind sent word of her acceptance, a simple notice that nevertheless sent shockwaves through London society. The Duke of Ravensmore, that most elusive and wealthy of matrimonial prizes, to wed Miss Rosalind Ashworth, the ruined girl who had lived in shadows for 5 years, and the whispers that followed were predictably vicious, a speculation running from secret pregnancy to blackmail to madness, though none could penetrate the Duke's controlled silence or the wall of protection he immediately erected around his intended bride. The wedding itself took place a mere fortnight later in the private chapel of Ravensmore Hall, attended only by Lady Pemberton and the Duke's elderly aunt, a hasty affair that nevertheless maintained every requirement of propriety. And as Rosalind stood in borrowed silk, for there had been no time for proper trousseau, and spoke vows that bound her irrevocably to this stern and controlled man beside her, she felt as though she moved through a dream, neither nightmare nor fantasy, but something suspended between. A transaction dressed in the trappings of sacrament. The Duke's voice remained steady as he pledged himself, his grey eyes meeting hers with an expression she could not quite decipher, something that might have been resolve or might have been resignation, and when he placed the heavy gold ring upon her finger, a Thornfield heirloom that had graced the hands of duchesses for generations, the weight of it felt like both anchor and chain. The journey to Ravensmore Hall proved silent, but not uncomfortable, the Duke seated opposite in the luxurious carriage, occasionally pointing out landmarks of the estate as they passed through gates and up the long drive lined with ancient oaks, until finally the house itself came into view, a sprawling testament to centuries of wealth and power, all grey stone and mullioned windows, beautiful and cold, and utterly foreign to the modest world Rosalind had inhabited. The housekeeper, Mrs. Davison, a woman of perhaps 50 with kind eyes and the quiet competence of long service, greeted them in the great hall and led Rosalind to what were now her apartments, a suite of rooms connected to but separate from the Duke's own chambers, decorated in soft blues and creams, with windows overlooking the formal gardens and furnishings of such quality that Rosalind felt almost afraid to touch them. Everything, speaking of consideration and expense, and the absolute reality of the transformation her life had undergone. His Grace instructed that you should arrange everything to your comfort, Your Grace, Mrs. Davison said with a small curtsy that made Rosalind's new title feel simultaneously real and absurd, and after the housekeeper departed, Rosalind stood alone in the centre of the sitting-room, turning slowly to take in the evidence of her new existence. Duchess, wife, mistress of this vast establishment, and felt nothing but a curious numbness, as though her capacity for feeling had been exhausted by the rapidity of change. That evening marked their first dinner as husband and wife, a formal affair in the smaller dining room that nevertheless felt cavernous with only 2 occupants, and as they navigated conversation about the estate, the servants, the expectations for her gradual introduction to neighborhood society, Rosalind marveled at how one could be married yet feel so utterly alone, bound yet separate, sharing space and name and future while remaining strangers behind walls of careful courtesy, until finally the Duke rose, bowed with perfect formality, and withdrew to his own apartments, leaving her to climb the stairs to chambers that were luxurious and lonely, where she lay in a bed fit for royalty, and wondered what exactly she had agreed to in accepting this cold bargain that promised everything except the one thing she had once, long ago, believed necessary to happiness. The months that followed their wedding passed with the measured rhythm of careful coexistence, as autumn deepened into winter and then gradually yielded to the tentative promise of early spring, and in that time Rosalind and the Duke Alexander, though she still thought of him primarily by his title, unable quite to claim the intimacy his Christian name implied, established a routine that was cordial, respectful, and maintained the careful boundaries they had agreed upon, yet was not without its small comforts and unexpected moments of connection. Each morning they shared breakfast in the sunny morning room, a custom he had insisted upon, despite the convention that might have kept them to separate schedules, and over toast and correspondence, they discussed the books they were reading. She had discovered his library to be magnificent, and he had given her free rein of it or matters pertaining to the estate, for he sought her opinion on tenant concerns and household decisions with a consideration that suggested he truly meant for her to be partner rather than ornament in this arrangement. He proved thoughtful in ways both large and small, ensuring her sitting room was always supplied with her preferred tea, arranging for a pianoforte to be brought from London when he learned she had once played, inquiring after her comfort without excessive attention, his manner always courteous yet distant, as though they were amiable colleagues in some vast enterprise rather than husband and wife. For her part, Rosalind found herself settling into the role of Duchess with more ease than she had anticipated. The responsibilities of managing such a large household, providing structure and purpose her previous existence had lacked, and she took satisfaction in small improvements, a more efficient arrangement of the still-room, better conditions for the scullery maids, a system for distributing surplus from the kitchens to families in the village, while always maintaining the emotional guardedness that had become her armor, never allowing herself to imagine that this careful partnership might become something more, never permitting hope to take root where it might once again be crushed. Their evenings unfolded in parallel but separate spheres, he to his study where he managed the complex affairs of his holdings and responded to correspondence from London, she to the drawing-room or her own sitting-room where she occupied herself with needlework or reading or the occasional letter to Lady Pemberton, and sometimes hours would pass without interaction beyond a polite good night when their paths crossed in the corridor. Yet there was something almost peaceful in this arrangement, a safety in the distance that allowed her to exist without constant vigilance. Still, she could not help but notice small things that accumulated, despite her intentions to remain detached, the way concentration furrowed his brow when he studied estate reports, how his rare smiles transformed the austere planes of his face into something almost boyish, the careful way he always ensured she was served first at meals, his habit of standing when she entered a room, even when they were alone. Gestures that spoke of respect and perhaps something more tender, though she dared not examine too closely what that might mean. Once, passing his study late at night, she had noticed light beneath the door and paused, hearing the scratch of his pen and imagining him bent over his desk. In that way she had glimpsed through doorways, and she had felt an unexpected longing not for passion but for simple companionship, for the right to knock and enter and sit quietly in his presence, without it meaning more than the comfort of shared space. Yet she had continued to her own chambers because they had agreed upon boundaries, and she would not be the one to breach them, would not risk the fragile equilibrium they had achieved by reaching for more than their bargain entitled her to expect. It was well past midnight when Rosalind, unable to sleep despite the hour and the warmth of her chambers, wrapped herself in a dressing gown and ventured downstairs in search of a book that might quiet her restless thoughts, the household silent around her, save for the settling sounds old houses make and the whisper of her slippers against cold marble, and she had expected the library to be dark and empty at such an hour, yet light spilled from beneath the door in a golden line that made her pause with her hand upon the handle, uncertain whether to intrude or retreat. Some impulse she could not name, curiosity perhaps, or that loneliness that had plagued her earlier, made her ease the door open quietly, and the scene that greeted her struck something deep and unexpected in her chest. Alexander stood before the dying fire, still fully dressed save for his coat and cravat, one hand braced against the mantelpiece and his head bowed in an attitude of such profound weariness that he seemed a different man entirely from the controlled, courteous Duke. She breakfasted with each morning, all his careful composure stripped away to reveal something raw and human and achingly vulnerable. She should have withdrawn, should have respected his privacy as he had always respected hers, yet something held her frozen in the doorway, and perhaps he sensed her presence, or perhaps the draught from the corridor alerted him, for he turned suddenly, and their eyes met across the book-lined space, his expression cycling through surprise and something that might have been embarrassment before settling into resignation. "Forgive me," she said quietly, finding her voice at last. "I did not mean to disturb you. I could not sleep and thought to find something to read." And she made to withdraw, to grant him the solitude he clearly sought, but his voice stopped her, rough with some emotion she could not identify, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the lateness of the hour. "Stay, if you wish," he said, and there was something almost pleading beneath the formal courtesy, as though he could not bear to be alone with whatever thoughts had driven him to this late vigil. And so she entered fully and closed the door behind her, moving to stand near the fire but maintaining a careful distance, uncertain of what was required or permitted in this moment that felt suspended outside the boundaries of their usual interaction. "I received word from London today," he said after a long silence, his gaze returning to the flames, regarding a matter from my past that I believed long settled. And then, perhaps because the hour stripped away pretense, or because the darkness made confession easier, he spoke with a raw honesty he had never before permitted himself in her presence, telling her not merely the outline of his youthful heartbreak that he had shared when proposing their arrangement, but the full bitter details, how the woman he had loved, the vicar's daughter he had planned to marry despite all opposition, had accepted money from his father to disappear, how he had searched for her desperately only to discover she had wed another within a month, how the betrayal had calcified something vital in his chest until he believed himself incapable of feeling anything beyond duty and obligation, how he had sworn never to permit anyone close enough to wound him so deeply again. Rosalind listened with her heart aching for the young man he had been, and when he finally fell silent, she found herself moving closer without conscious decision, drawn by an instinct toward comfort that overrode her usual caution, until she stood near enough to see the firelight reflected in his eyes, near enough that when she reached out tentatively to touch his sleeve, the first deliberate physical contact between them, beyond the formal requirements of dancing or dining, she felt him start slightly at the unexpected tenderness of the gesture. "I understand," she said softly, and the weight of shared pain hung between them, recognition of kindred wounding, and for a moment that stretched and held, they remained thus, closer than they had ever been, awareness crackling in the space between them like static before a storm, until Alexander drew in a sharp breath and stepped back, his expression shuttering closed once more, and she understood that she had frightened him, or that he had frightened himself with this breach in the careful walls they had constructed, and so she withdrew as well, murmuring something about the lateness of the hour, and fled to her chambers with her heart racing and her careful equilibrium shattered, knowing that something fundamental had shifted between them, and uncertain whether to welcome or fear what that shift might herald. Spring arrived at Ravensmoor Hall with an insistence that seemed to mirror some internal thaw occurring between its Duke and Duchess, the grounds transforming from winter's austerity into something verdant and alive, daffodils pushing through softened earth and apple trees in the orchards, clothing themselves in clouds of pale blossoms, and perhaps it was the season's influence, or perhaps that moment of raw vulnerability in the library had cracked something in the foundations of their careful distance. But Rosalind found that the weeks following that late-night encounter brought a subtle yet unmistakable shift in the tenor of their interactions, as though both had glimpsed something in the other that made their previous formality suddenly insufficient. Alexander began suggesting they walk the grounds together after breakfast when weather permitted, ostensibly to discuss improvements to the gardens, but in truth engaging her in conversations that ranged far beyond horticulture, philosophy, and literature, and questions about her thoughts on matters both weighty and trivial. His attention focused upon her with an intensity that made her both nervous and strangely exhilarated, as though she were being truly seen, perhaps for the first time in years. She noticed how he watched her when he thought himself unobserved, his expression holding something tender and uncertain that he quickly shuttered when their eyes met, and she wondered if her own face betrayed similar confusion, for she found herself thinking of him at odd moments throughout the day. Alexander, she had begun allowing herself to think of him thus, in the privacy of her own mind, wondering what he might think of a particular passage in her current book, or whether he would find amusement in some small household incident, her thoughts turning toward him with a frequency that would have alarmed her had she permitted herself to examine too closely what such preoccupation might signify. When they attended a small gathering at a neighboring estate, she witnessed his subtle protectiveness manifest in a way that sent warmth flooding through her chest. Lady Hartwell, a woman known for her cutting tongue and long memory, made some carefully barbed remark about hasty marriages and charitable impulses, the implication clear even through the veneer of politeness, and before Rosalind could summon a response, Alexander was there, his voice cool as winter steel, as he delivered a rejoinder so perfectly calibrated to put the woman in her place without descending to actual rudeness that several nearby guests barely concealed their smiles, his hand coming to rest briefly at the small of Rosalind's back in a gesture of unmistakable solidarity that made her want to weep with gratitude and something deeper she dared not name. Later that same week, his cousin Gerald arrived for a brief visit and proved himself possessed of unfortunate opinions about Alexander's management of certain estate matters. His criticism, delivered with the presumption of one who believed family connection, entitled him to pronounce judgment, and Rosalind surprised them both by speaking up firmly in defense of decisions she had witnessed firsthand, her knowledge of the particulars silencing Gerald's objections and earning her a look from Alexander that held such frank admiration and perhaps affection that she felt it like a physical touch, and in the quiet of her chambers that evening she was forced to acknowledge what she had been avoiding for weeks. That regard had grown beyond their careful arrangement into something far more dangerous, that she cared for this man, who was her husband in name but not in truth, that somewhere in the accumulation of shared breakfasts and thoughtful gestures and moments of unexpected understanding, she had begun to hope again, despite every vow she had made to herself never to permit such foolishness, and the realization terrified her, even as it bloomed warm and insistent beneath her ribs, a spring awakening she had no notion how to contain or whether she even wished to try. The necessity of attending the Marchioness of Westbrook's spring ball had been discussed and reluctantly agreed upon, for Alexander's position demanded occasional appearance at such significant social events, and Rosalind had begun to feel strong enough in her identity as his Duchess to weather the scrutiny such occasions inevitably brought. Yet as their carriage rolled through London's lamplight streets, she felt an unease she could not entirely attribute to the usual anxiety such gatherings provoked, some instinct whispering warnings she could not articulate even to herself, as Alexander handed her down and they ascended the marble steps into the glittering crush of society at its most resplendent. The evening proceeded, as such events always did, Careful conversations and practiced smiles, Alexander's steady presence at her side like an anchor, several ladies who had previously cut her, now offering cautious civility, given her elevated position, and she was beginning to relax into the familiar rhythm when she felt it, that prickling awareness of being watched by eyes that held neither admiration nor mere curiosity, and she turned almost against her will to scan the crowded ballroom until her gaze locked with one she had not seen in 5 years, yet would have recognized anywhere, in any circumstance, until her dying day. Edmund Ashcroft stood near the terrace doors, older and harder than she remembered, but unmistakably himself, his handsome face turned toward her with an expression that mingled calculation and something that might have been regret, and the world seemed to tilt sickeningly beneath her feet, all sound fading to a distant roar as 5 years collapsed into nothing, and she was 18 again. Ruined and desperate and abandoned, she must have made some sound, or perhaps Alexander simply felt her distress through whatever connection had grown between them, for his hand found hers instantly, his voice low and urgent, asking what was wrong, and she could not form words, but her stricken gaze must have communicated everything, for she felt him go absolutely still beside her, his entire body tensing as he followed her line of sight, and understood precisely what threat had materialized in their midst. Before she could gather her scattered thoughts, Edmund was moving toward them with the easy confidence that had once beguiled her foolish young heart, navigating through the crowd with clear purpose, and Alexander's grip on her hand tightened almost painfully as he positioned himself slightly in front of her, a barrier between her and the approaching specter of her past, and when Edmund reached them and attempted to bow, to speak some pleasantry as though they were merely old acquaintances meeting by happy chance, Alexander's voice cut through the attempt with a coldness that could have frozen champagne in its crystal flutes, informing Edmund in terms that barely maintained the veneer of civility that his presence was neither required nor desired, and that he would be wise to take himself elsewhere immediately. Edmund's eyes flickered with something, anger perhaps, or shame, or that recklessness that had always lurked beneath his charm, and he addressed himself directly to Rosalind, saying he had hoped for a private word, that he had returned to England, specifically seeking the opportunity to make amends for past wrongs, that surely she would grant him a moment to explain what circumstances had driven his regrettable actions, and the audacity of it, the presumption that she owed him anything, least of all an audience, struck her like a physical blow, even as Alexander's controlled fury radiated beside her, his entire bearing that of a man holding violence on the thinnest of leashes, and she knew with sudden clarity that she needed to leave, and to escape before she shattered completely before the assembled representatives of the society that had judged her so harshly, and she whispered Alexander's name, just that, nothing more, and he understood instantly, making their excuses and guiding her toward the exit, with a hand at her back that trembled minutely with the force of his restrained rage, and as they descended to their waiting carriage, she could feel the old wounds tearing open, fresh and bleeding, all the careful healing of recent months threatened by the return of the man who had destroyed her, and she wept silently in the darkness as Alexander held her hand and did not speak, for what words could possibly suffice against the resurrection of such comprehensive ruin? The journey back to their London residence passed in silence, broken only by her ragged breathing and the occasional soft sound of distress she could not suppress, Alexander's hand gripping hers with a steadiness that felt like the only solid thing in a world gone liquid and unstable. And when they arrived, he dismissed the servants with a terseness that brooked no question, guiding her himself up the stairs to her chambers, where the carefully constructed composure she had maintained finally shattered completely. 5 years of accumulated grief and shame, pouring forth in great wrenching sobs that shook her entire frame as she sank onto the settee near the fire, hands covering her face as though she could hide from her own anguish. She felt the settee dip as Alexander sat beside her, closer than propriety dictated, closer than they had ever been except for that one moment in the library, and then his arms were around her with a tenderness that broke something further inside her, pulling her against his chest as he murmured wordless comfort, one hand stroking her hair with a gentleness she would never have imagined from the cold duke who had proposed their arrangement so many months ago, and she wept into his coat until exhaustion began to claim the storm, her breathing gradually evening into shuddering gasps as the worst passed and left her hollowed and raw. "Forgive me," she whispered against the damp fabric of his evening coat. shame flooding through her at this display, at her weakness, at the way she had fled the ball like a frightened child. But Alexander's arms only tightened, his voice rough as he told her there was nothing to forgive, that she owed no one strength in the face of such an encounter, and something in his fierce protectiveness made fresh tears slide down her cheeks. Though these felt different somehow, less about old pain and more about present overwhelming emotion she could not name. She pulled back enough to meet his eyes, finding them dark with concern and something deeper that made her breath catch, and the words began spilling from her almost against her will, how she still felt the stain of Edmund's touch, how she had believed herself healed, but his reappearance proved her still broken, how she feared she would never be free of the shame that marked her, how she felt herself unworthy of the name Alexander had given her, of the protection he offered, of anything good or clean or whole. "Stop," Alexander commanded, his hands coming up to frame her face with a care that belied the intensity of his voice, his thumbs brushing away tears as his eyes searched hers with an urgency that stole what remained of her breath. "You will not speak so of yourself, do you understand? That man stole your innocence, but he does not define your worth. You are not ruined, Rosalind. You are not broken. You are not less than you were, and I will not permit you to carry his sins as though they were your own." The fierceness of his declaration, the absolute conviction in his voice, cracked something in the careful walls she had built around the tender hopes that had been growing these past weeks, and she stared at him through tear-blurred vision as he continued, his voice dropping to something almost reverent, as he told her she was brilliant and strong and worthy of every good thing this life could offer, that her past did not diminish her, but rather revealed the incredible resilience that had allowed her to survive what would have destroyed lesser souls, that he considered it the greatest privilege of his life to call her his wife, and that he would spend whatever time she granted him, proving that she deserved to be cherished, and before she could fully comprehend what she saw in his expression, he was leaning forward with a slowness that gave her every opportunity to retreat. But she did not retreat, could not, and when his lips brushed hers with a gentleness that felt like a question and a promise and a revelation all at once, she found herself answering with a kiss that tasted of salt and hope, and the beginning of believing that perhaps she might, against all odds and reason, deserve this unexpected grace. The kiss broke gently, reluctantly, both of them drawing back just enough to search each other's faces in the firelight, and Alexander's hands still cradled her face with such tenderness that fresh tears threatened, though these carried none of the anguish that had consumed her earlier. And when he spoke, his voice held a tremor she had never heard from the composed Duke, who had proposed their arrangement with such clinical precision, telling her that he needed to confess something that he had sworn to himself would remain forever unspoken, that he had entered their marriage with every intention of maintaining the emotional distance he had promised, but that somewhere between their morning conversations and evening courtesies, between watching her gentle kindness with servants and fierce intelligence in debate, between 1,000 small moments he had not recognized as significant until their cumulative weight became undeniable, he had fallen utterly and irrevocably in love with her, and he understood this confession violated the terms of their arrangement. But he could no longer pretend indifference when Edmund's reappearance had crystallized the terrifying truth that he would destroy any threat to her well-being, without hesitation or regret, that his careful control was nothing against the fierce protectiveness and desperate devotion she inspired. Rosalind stared at him in wonder and terror both, for his words offered everything she had ceased, believing she might ever possess. Yet accepting them meant rendering herself vulnerable in ways that still terrified her, despite the healing these months had wrought, and her voice shook as she told him she did not know if she possessed the courage to trust love again, that Edmund's betrayal had taught her that hearts were treacherous things that transformed overnight from devoted to indifferent, and what promise could Alexander offer that he would not likewise discover her insufficient and withdraw the regard he now professed so earnestly? Something shifted in Alexander's expression, an acceptance of her fear without offense, and he took her hands in his with deliberate gentleness, telling her that he offered no promises save those already made at their wedding, fidelity, respect, partnership, but that he would prove through actions rather than words the constancy of his attachment, that he would wait however long she required to feel safe in believing him, that their marriage would proceed precisely as she wished, whether she ever returned his feelings or not, for loving her did not entitle him to demands or expectations, but rather obligated him to honor her needs above his own desires. And if she needed time, then time she would have, months or years or forever if that was what her healing required. The patient devotion in his declaration, the complete absence of pressure or expectation, cracked something fundamental in the walls she had built around her battered heart, and she found herself confessing in whispered fragments that she thought perhaps she was already halfway to loving him, that the regard she had told herself was merely friendship and gratitude had deepened into something that frightened her with its intensity, that she wanted desperately to believe in the possibility of genuine love, but scarcely knew how to silence the voices that insisted she did not deserve such grace. And Alexander pulled her close again, his lips brushing her forehead as he murmured that they would learn together, that they would build something true from the foundation of their honest arrangement, that he would spend whatever remained of his life proving himself worthy of the extraordinary gift of her trust. And as she rested against his chest, listening to his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her ear, she felt something she had not experienced since before Edmund's betrayal. Hope, fragile and tentative but undeniably real, that perhaps love might not inevitably end in abandonment, that perhaps she might risk opening her wounded heart once more and find not destruction, but healing in the devotion of a man who had somehow learned to see past her ruination to the woman who had survived it. The morning broke cold and clear, winter's first breath frosting the windows of their London residence, and Alexander rose with a purpose that Rosalind recognized in the set of his shoulders as he dressed with particular care. His expression holding that quiet intensity that spoke of decisions made and consequences accepted, and when she asked his intentions, he told her simply that certain matters required addressing, that Edmund Ashcroft's return to England and attempt to approach her could not stand without response, that the man had escaped justice once through flight, but would not do so again. And though apprehension flickered through her at the thought of further confrontation, she found herself trusting Alexander's judgment in ways she would not have believed possible mere months ago, understanding that his actions arose not from reckless pride, but from deliberate protection of what he held dear. She learned the details later from Lady Pemberton, who heard it from no fewer than 6 sources, all eager to share the remarkable scene that had unfolded at White's, where Alexander had appeared during the fashionable hour, knowing full well that Edmund frequented the establishment. And when Edmund entered, the Duke had risen with terrifying composure and addressed him before the assembled company, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room, as he stated that Lord Edmund Ashcroft stood accused of the most despicable cowardice, that he had deliberately compromised an innocent young woman of good family, abandoned her to face society's censure alone, and when challenged honorably by her brother had killed that brother in a duel before fleeing the country rather than face the consequences of his dishonor, and now returned expecting to resume his place in society, as though these sins could be overlooked or forgotten. Edmund had attempted to bluster, to claim misunderstanding, to suggest that the lady in question had been willing, but Alexander had stepped forward with such cold fury that 3 men moved to restrain what they feared might become violence, his voice dropping to something deadly as he clarified that the lady was now his Duchess, that any slander against her name would be answered as an attack upon his own honor, and that Edmund would depart England within a fortnight, or face not a duel, but rather complete social and financial destruction, for Alexander possessed both the connections and the determination to ensure that Edmund found no welcome in any respectable establishment, no credit with any reputable tradesman, no tolerance from any family of standing, and that this was mercy far beyond what Edmund deserved, for he allowed him to slink away with his life when Rosalind's brother had been granted no such consideration. The witnesses reported Edmund's face draining of color as Alexander enumerated precisely which influential lords had already agreed to cut him, which banks had been persuaded to call in his debts, which hostesses had struck him from their lists, the comprehensive nature of the exile, revealing both the extent of Alexander's influence and the depth of his commitment to Rosalind's vindication, and when Edmund attempted one final protest, Alexander had simply turned his back in the ultimate gesture of dismissal, the assembled gentlemen following his lead until Edmund stood isolated in the center of the room, his cowardice and disgrace made manifest before the very society whose good opinion he had sought to regain. Within days, the news had spread through every drawing-room and ballroom in London, the story growing with each telling but the essential facts remaining consistent. The Duke of Ravensmore had publicly championed his Duchess, had revealed the true villain in the tale that society had previously judged so harshly against Rosalind, and Edmund Ashcroft had been exposed as not merely a rake, but a coward and a murderer who had allowed an innocent woman to bear the shame of his sins. And Rosalind felt the shift in how people regarded her when she next appeared in public, saw sympathy replace censure in expressions that had previously held only judgment, received acknowledgments from women who had cut her for 5 years, and though she knew some of this arose simply from Alexander's power and position, she recognized too that truth had finally displaced the lies. Edmund's abandonment had allowed society to assume that her name had been cleared, not through her own protests, which would never have been believed, but through the unimpeachable word of a man whose honor none dared question. Summer arrived at Ravensmore Hall with a glory that seemed to mirror the transformation unfolding within its ancient walls. Roses climbing the stone with abandon, and gardens bursting into riotous bloom, and on a morning when golden light spilled across the grounds, Alexander found Rosalind standing in the very garden where she had once confessed the details of her ruin. But where that earlier moment had been shadowed by shame this morning, she stood, bathed in sunlight with her face turned upward, and something approaching peace in her expression. And when he approached, she turned to him with a smile that held none of the wariness that had characterized their early months together, reaching for his hand, with a naturalness that still made his chest tighten with gratitude for the gift of her trust. And he drew her close there among the roses, mindful that any servant might observe, but no longer caring for propriety when she fit so perfectly against him, and she laughed softly at his boldness before lifting her face for his kiss, and what had begun tentatively weeks ago had deepened into something that spoke of genuine passion alongside the deeper current of authentic love. And when he suggested they retire to the privacy of their chambers, no longer separate but shared, as she had shyly requested after Edmund's exile, she agreed with a blush that he found utterly enchanting, and their joining that afternoon held none of the awkward formality that had characterized the early consummation required by duty, but rather the tender intimacy of two people who had learned to trust not merely each other, but the love they had discovered against all expectation. And afterward, as they lay tangled together in the great bed that had once seemed too large for solitary occupation, Rosalind traced patterns on his chest and confessed in wondering tones that she had believed this particular joy forever lost to her, that she had convinced herself that love and desire were luxuries ruined women must relinquish. Yet here she lay utterly cherished and safe in ways that bore no resemblance to the reckless passion that had destroyed her girlhood, and Alexander kissed her temple and murmured that she had never been ruined, except in the judgment of those too blind to recognize her worth. That she had always deserved this tenderness and devotion, and they remained there talking in quiet voices about everything and nothing until the light shifted toward evening, and duty finally called them back to the world beyond their private sanctuary. And as summer ripened toward autumn with its harvest abundance, Rosalind began experiencing certain unmistakable signs that sent her to Alexander one morning, with trembling hands and tear-bright eyes, and when she whispered that she believed herself with child, his reaction fierce joy and immediate protectiveness, and something approaching reverence as he placed his hand over her, still flat belly banished the last lingering fears, that his devotion might prove transient, and through the autumn months, as her condition became apparent, they settled into a contentment that bore no resemblance to the careful formality of their arrangement, walking the estate grounds hand in hand, while discussing names and futures, reading together in the library with her feet in his lap, and his hand resting possessively on her growing belly, stealing kisses in corridors like besotted newlyweds rather than the practical partners they had agreed to be. And when winter arrived with its crystalline beauty, and she grew large with their child, he treated her with such devoted attention that the servants smiled indulgently and remarked to each other that the Duke had clearly lost his heart completely to his Duchess, and Rosalind no longer flinched from the designation, but wore it with quiet pride, understanding finally that she had not merely survived her ruin, but had been transformed through patience and unexpected grace into something stronger and more genuine than the naive girl she had been. that authentic love bore little resemblance to the empty promises and reckless passion that had destroyed her youth, and that the arrangement she had accepted from desperation had become, against all probability, the truest and most precious thing she had ever known. 3 years had passed since that autumn when their first child arrived, and Ravensmoor Hall had transformed from the quiet, formal estate of Alexander's bachelor years into something altogether warmer, filled with the sounds of childish laughter and the comfortable chaos that accompanied young life. And on a morning in early spring, Rosalind stood at the nursery window, watching Alexander on the lawn below, with their daughter Catherine, who had just turned 3, and their son Thomas, barely 18 months, Alexander having abandoned all ducal dignity to chase them through the gardens while they shrieked with delighted terror, and the sight made something expand in her chest, with such force that she pressed a hand there, as though to contain the overwhelming gratitude for this life she had never imagined possible in those dark years when she believed herself forever marked by shame. And when Alexander glanced up and caught her watching, his face broke into that particular smile he reserved only for her, unguarded and genuine, and holding such clear devotion that even now it sometimes made her breath catch, and he scooped Thomas onto his shoulders and took Catherine's hand and led them back toward the house, calling up that surely their mother would join them for their walk to the lake. And she hurried down to meet them with her own face bright with answering joy, and Catherine launched herself at Rosalind's skirts, declaring that Papa had promised they might feed the swans, and Thomas reached for her with chubby arms, and Alexander drew close to kiss her temple in casual affection that spoke of absolute comfort and security, murmuring that she looked particularly lovely this morning, and she leaned into him briefly, savoring the solid warmth of him and the knowledge that this intimacy would never diminish, that the love they had built from such practical beginnings had only deepened with time and challenge into something unshakable. And as they walked together toward the lake with the children running ahead and circling back like delighted puppies, Alexander took her hand and said quietly that he had been thinking how remarkable their journey had been, how the arrangement he had proposed from pragmatic necessity had become the greatest blessing of his life, and she squeezed his fingers and replied that she had been ruined at 18 and believed her life effectively over, yet here she stood at 26, more truly happy than that naive girl had ever dreamed possible. And he stopped there on the path and turned her to face him properly, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite gentleness, as he told her what he had told her countless times, but which she never tired of hearing, that she had never been ruined, except in the estimation of fools, that she was the finest woman he had ever known, that he thanked Providence daily for the chance encounter that had brought her into his life. And she rose on her toes to kiss him there, in full view of anyone who might observe, no longer caring for society's judgment, because she had learned finally that true worth was not determined by the opinions of others, but by the love one gave and received, by the life one built through patience and courage. And Catherine called impatiently for them to hurry, and Thomas toddled back to tug at Alexander's coat, and they continued toward the lake as a family, and complete and genuine, and filled with the kind of deep abiding happiness that arose not from untested innocence, but from having survived darkness and chosen trust, despite fear. And Rosalind understood with crystalline clarity that her ruin had paradoxically led her to redemption, that the shame she had carried for so long had been transformed, through Alexander's steadfast devotion, into something approaching wisdom, and that the arrangement proposed by the coldly intellectual Duke had become the truest love story she could have imagined, built on honesty and respect, and the daily choice to cherish what they had built together.